Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program. And this year I'm partnering with Flatirons to run a series of events on ethics topics as it overlaps with technology and business, of which today's event is a part. Before I turn to more information on today's event, I'd like to make a plug for tomorrow's conference on artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and the law. The conference will begin with a breakfast and go throughout the day, featuring a keynote by Professor Surden and multiple panels throughout the day. I'd also encourage you to attend our next event in this ethics series, which will be held on April 1st, with panel presentations on ethics of AI and privacy. You can find registration information for both of these events on Silicon Flatirons' website. Before I turn things over for panel introductions, I'd like to thank our amazing team that helped make today's event possible. Professor Surden will be moderating today's discussion, Michelle Logan on the Daniels Fund team, and Brad Bernthal, Nate Mariotti, Shannon Sturgeon, Christine McCloskey, and Sarah Schnickgun with Silicon Flatirons. Finally, for attending students who have to get to a class at 1 o'clock today, I'm going to interrupt the panel right around 12:50-ish so that we can pause and give you a chance to get out all at once. So don't worry, don't feel like you have to start packing up and slowly slinking out one at a time. We'll give you a space to do that. So panel, sorry in advance for interrupting you. Now I would like to hand things over to Finn Fehrenbach, a Colorado Law 2L, who will be introducing our moderator and panelists for today.
Hey everyone, it's super nice to be here with you guys today. My name is Finn Fehrenbach, I'm Secretary with the Law School. I'm super excited to introduce today's panel discussion on the ethics of artificial intelligence in healthcare applications. The panel will be moderated by Professor Surden, an expert in artificial intelligence and the law, and the director of the Silicon Flatirons Artificial Intelligence Initiative. Joining him in the discussion are Doug Chapnick, founder and CEO of BioLoomics, and a veteran of cell biology with 20 years of experience engineering in the life sciences space. Calli Schroeder, Senior Counsel and AI Human Rights Program Lead at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, also known as Chapnick. She supervises, coordinates, and leads ethics work on artificial intelligence and strategy at the local, state, federal, and international levels. Also, super cool, Calli was a 2016 graduate of CU Law. And then finally, Kathleen Sutton, shareholder at Polsinelli, whose practice focuses on an array of healthcare, regulatory, and business matters. Also happy to say that Kathleen is a CU Law alum. Please join me in welcoming our guest.
Thank you so much, Finn, for that great introduction. I also, before we start, I also want to do a couple of thank yous. As Finn mentioned, I'm Surden. I'm a professor here at the law school and director of the Silicon Flatirons Artificial Intelligence Initiative. And today we're here to talk about the growing role of artificial intelligence in healthcare, its benefits, its risks, and ethical and legal implications. Before I start, I want to thank Melanie Kay for her excellent work. I also want to second a thank you to the tremendous Silicon Flatirons team, which Melanie mentioned, our terrific volunteer students who both help in the background and are attending. Finally, all of you are wonderful participants. I'm delighted that we have such an expert panel joining me. Finn did a great opportunity. I'll also mention that Doug is a CU alum, a PhD from
not law school, but
not the law school, but
buildings of
alum of our amazing university here. So we've really delightful panel of experts who are going to help us understand these issues. Before we get to our panel questions, I think it's helpful to have a very short overview of what's happened in AI in healthcare. We've seen a dramatic uptick in the use of artificial intelligence in the health setting, both in the clinical setting between doctor and patient, and also in the research setting, researching pharmaceuticals and in the biotech sector, as well as in clinical medical research. This has happened especially since 2023. And for those of you who have followed my research or seen any of my talks or tomorrow, I've been emphasizing the beginning of 2023 as an inflection point in AI with the release of large language models like ChatGPT, where AI suddenly got good in one particular area, which is in knowledge work involving thinking, reasoning, and understanding the ordinary language that humans communicate. And he couldn't do that before. So we entered this new era of machines that could reason and think about anything from clinical symptoms and other audio visual modalities in ways that they could not. And because of this, we're now seeing AI in a variety of healthcare settings. We'll hear this from our panelists, but these include anything from diagnostic and treatment to transcription of doctor notes to assisting scientists, researchers, and engineers in clinical trials or pharmaceutical research. So that will be the focus of today's discussion. The domains of law, regulation, ethics, and privacy are struggling to keep up with all of these challenges and changes, but I believe our panelists will solve it here today. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our terrific panel. And I will address the first question to Kathleen. So you have a practice in the healthcare setting. And so you're really on the front lines on seeing a lot of different aspects of AI use in hospitals and the doctor-patient setting and in the regulatory framework. So what are you actually seeing on the ground in terms of your clients in your practice area, the use of AI in healthcare?
So I represent healthcare providers in different settings, so hospital, physician practice, kind of all across the spectrum there. And to your point, 2023 was a dramatic change. We've started seeing a lot of experimentation, a lot of new tools coming out using generative AI in healthcare settings. I think I would probably lump the different tools that we're seeing into 3 categories, and with the caveat, there's a lot of overlap between them. The ones that people are most excited about, I would say, fall into the diagnostic and treatment, workflows, and payment. I think the one that kind of overlays all of these would be the scribe function for medical practitioners, clinicians. There's a lot of excitement and a lot of movement in this area. The administrative side has become so burdensome for healthcare providers and clinicians that there's so much excitement about taking that burden away in a way that is very helpful and very useful and also ideally accurate. We can talk about some of the risks around this as well, but there's so much excitement around Navla, Deep Scribe. There's a lot of different players in this area. But some of the things that help with workflow management in terms of getting that administrative side taken care of, it can also be an assistant for diagnostic with hearing symptoms and things like that, and presenting differential diagnosis and helping a clinician walk through that as part of the transcription, as well as assisting with payment, showing that within the note, there's all the key terms that need to be there for medical necessity in order for insurance companies and other payers to pay for that claim. So within each of these buckets, there are tools that are addressing all of these. There's a lot of excitement around not only the efficiency that comes out of it, but sort of the accuracy and motion of outcomes of medicine. So those are the categories that I'm seeing. And I'd also do a small side note that that's in all areas of healthcare, but particularly physical health, and the tools we're seeing in behavioral health. So really fascinating, particularly on the treatment side. That's sort of its own additional category of, managing symptoms, identifying crises early on and treating those, whether through medication modification or through chatbots and things like that. There's a lot of really interesting things happening on the behavioral side as well.
And in terms of benefits and risks, what are you telling your clients, whether it's hospitals or doctors who want to say use AI transcription or AI, what was the term you used where it kind of listens in the background? Ambient AI, yeah. What sort of advice are you giving?
There's so much excitement around this that it was really hard to slow down.
Yeah.
And understandably, my spouse is a clinician as well, and I'm grateful that maybe he won't have to spend the whole next day after he sees patients charting. So there's so much excitement around this to be able to So how these work is the clinician goes in, they push a button on their tablet or whatever they have, and the AI basically listens into the patient-provider interaction and will create the note, a draft of the note for the provider. So the provider can focus on the patient, which is amazing, to bring that focus back, go back to the old art of communication within medicine. And clinicians are really excited about that component as well. And then after the visit, they can go review that note and say, yep, that looks right. That's what we're doing. And it takes them, a couple of minutes rather than hours of, reviewing the chart, reviewing their history, making sure that their note says what it needs to. So that's the exciting part. On some of the risk, I think the two risks that I think about a lot are over-reliance. I think a helpful analogy here is if you think about the high school chemistry, when you're running an experiment and you know what the outcome is supposed to be. And so if something goes wrong, you're like, I messed up. And so our clinicians, there's a risk that our clinicians are going to start using these tools in that way to say, oh, AI didn't say this thing, that's what I think it is. So why didn't it say that? I must have messed up, let's just go with what the tool says. There's a real risk around that with over-reliance because there's this air of reliability that comes with these tools that may or may not be warranted. So we really want to encourage clinicians to not abandon all of the clinical practice that they know and make sure that we're training new clinicians coming up on making sure they're running through all of it in their differential as well. The second risk I think we need to be very cautious about is amplification. And this is amplification not only of medical errors or misdiagnoses, and that can be caused in a lot of ways based on the inputs going into the AI model, based on a lot of things. But if you have a bad provider without an AI tool, that's going to be limited to that provider or that patient. But if that is built into the model, that's an patient. And so we're really worried about the risk of amplification of errors. And then also, of course, the risk of amplification of bias. So if the AI model has taken the bias that we know is in the healthcare system, it is using that data going in, then it's going to spit out that same bias. And now you don't necessarily have the checks on that. So one example is a tool developed very thoughtfully to help with the diagnosis of a childhood illness. And the developers were very thoughtful about having very diverse samples. But the tool took the data and decided that Spanish-speaking patients had some resistance to this condition. Turns out that's not the case. It just slowed down because at some point there needed to be a translator. So it was a slower diagnostic process. It's not the patients had resistance, it's that the diagnosis was found later. So there are real risks of amplifying that type of bias and error that we need to be really thoughtful of we're developing these tools.
Yeah, those are all great points. And just a follow-up, how are you seeing in terms of the accuracy of the transcription and the diagnosis? Because I always like to remind people, we definitely want to be careful about the reliability of AI systems. And also we have to compare it to the alternative baseline, which is humans make errors. So in the past, we never really knew if a doctor was listening and maybe missed a couple of symptoms or mistranscribed notes later. So how are you, what are you seeing?
There's a couple of components. One, I think, is how is the model trained? And there are some privacy implications to this, which I think we'll probably talk about. Is the data trained on a large amount? Is the model trained a large amount of data and what types of inputs we're seeing? That's going to affect the accuracy, as well as the transcription. That's going to depend also on the clinicians vocalizing what they're seeing. And that's another element of training clinicians are going to need is vocalizing their differential as they go through it. So if the model isn't missing those things. And then they have to review it. I mean, there are just that come out that are just, mistranslations and mistranscriptions. So again, it goes back a little bit to that over-reliance. They have to review it. That said, it's good enough that people are loving it and they're really adopting it very quickly because it is such a time saver. And they can go through and say, oh, I didn't mean to say that word. It's this, but that takes a matter of, maybe 5-10 minutes at the most, as opposed to hours writing the chart. So there are still errors, there are still things to be concerned about, but overall, it's really exciting.
Let me throw this out to the rest of the panel. Where are you guys seeing AI in action? Doug, do you want to?
So in biotech, which is basically the fancy class of making drugs to cure diseases, you see it in every aspect of the pipeline. So either predicting what to drug who to give the drug to, what the drug will be, or maybe a list of drugs that you then put into sort of early trials. But I think I am on a lot of AI and bio panels. The big question is not where will we use it, which is where we're at right now. It's where will it work? And I think we'll be talking about that for the next 13 years until we get conclusive answers on whether we're making better drugs. So it's everywhere. Even just filing the paperwork for clinical trials is being automated, so similar to the transcription. That can cause problems, but we won't really know that unless somebody digs in deep and has a problem with a drug and tries to contest the clinical trial or something like that. And that'll be another 4 years. So it'll take a long time for us to do this. It's been going on in bio for 2012. Recursion, if you're familiar with that, came out saying it would cure 10 diseases in 10 years. We're past that. So that wasn't true. But it's exciting. I'm excited because some places it'll work really, really well and we'll have cures. So we don't have cures for many things, just put that out there. We have treatments for many things and they're a sliding scale. So I think the excitement is that in our lifetime, we might have cures for things that will be alien for people in this room.
And Kelly, where in your practice, where are you seeing healthcare and AI?
Oh, everywhere. For a little bit of background, I work for a nonprofit, and in general, we focus on privacy and human rights issues. But as you can imagine, a ton of new technology intersects with privacy. And so in a lot of cases, we kind of become accidental pseudo experts on these things because we just have to engage with them so much. So from our perspective, absolutely, we're seeing a ton of use of AI in like diagnostic treatment and in the administrative roles, definitely in payments and for sure in clinical research. Frankly, it's kind of encouraging because those are some of the few areas where AI is being used where not always, but frequently it's used in like the most responsible ways. The problem that we have with AI in a lot of cases, by we, I mean Epic, not, everybody. But the problem that I run into a lot with AI is that in many cases, the way the models are built is fundamentally dangerous. It exacerbates a lot of risk. You can get very low quality and inaccurate results. And in some cases, that's not great, but it's not critical. Like if I plug a prompt into ChatGPT and it gives me some inaccurate facts that then come out in like an essay I'm writing, it's not great and it doesn't reflect great on me that I'm regurgitating incorrect information, but it's not going to cause lasting harm to anything but like my grade. In healthcare, there is real lasting harm that can happen if you're getting inaccurate information. So being able to have like carefully curated data sets where you're checking where all of your information is coming from, you're making sure it's accurate, you're making sure there's not context that's missing. Because a machine cannot parse context unless you are programming that into the machine. They do not understand like historical background of where information is coming from. They don't necessarily understand that like the translation issue, the translator issue is a factor in how you're evaluating things. It is just what information they're being trained on, how they're developing an algorithm, how that algorithm is applied. There's not a lot else that comes in unless programmers intentionally do that. So all of those are considerations for me when I'm looking at AI in healthcare. The other issue that I run into a lot is that there are a lot of applications of AI that connect to healthcare, but in ways that are not covered by HIPAA. So HIPAA only covers if you are a provider of healthcare, if you're a business associate, it's a fairly limited scope. If you are not a doctor that's providing healthcare, if you are not licensed in some way, in many cases, HIPAA doesn't apply, so you're not getting protections through that. So the things that we're seeing that connect AI and healthcare are things like, there are a lot of devices that track your location data pretty regularly to wherever you're going. They'll track your phone information, they'll track your smartwatch, they'll track your laptop if you are hauling that around with you. And so a big area that we're working in right now is reproductive healthcare and reproductive rights and safety and privacy in that area. It's really easy if you're constantly tracking location information and that information is not protected by a federal law to infer if you're going to an abortion clinic, pretty easy guess what's going on there. If you're going to an HIV treatment clinic, you can make a reasonable inference that person may have HIV. These are really, really sensitive areas of healthcare and personal information that can be extrapolated often through AI, often through buying information from data brokers, getting it from multiple data points. It's a lot of situations where there's really sensitive healthcare information that's being revealed through AI extrapolations. So that's one area we're tracking that I don't think gets paid attention to as much because it just doesn't fall under what we typically think of as healthcare. One other area is you mentioned the behavioral uses. Behavioral treatment is a really interesting thing. There is a huge shortage of therapists in many cases. People don't have a lot of access to like mental health help. And so there's been a lot of proposals about using chatbots or AI in a way to provide some kind of mental health care if you can't get access to a person. There are some really serious risks with that as well. One is that a lot of those models are not transparent about what all they're including in their training data sets. And we very strongly suspect, and in a couple cases can demonstrate that what you're inputting into those chatbots is being fed back into the training data. So if you're revealing really sensitive, painful personal information to what you think of as a digital therapist, that is not subject to the same confidentiality that you would assume with a person. It's being fed into training data sets, it's being used to train the algorithm further, train its responses. And in many cases, we've seen that the security on these systems is not great. So raw training data can be revealed from some of these systems. That's another risk factor to consider and look at. And I think it's a really interesting application of AI in healthcare because it's got potential to go really, really well and be really, really helpful. But because it's so high risk, it also has potential to go really, really badly.
Yeah, those are all great points. Thank you for sharing. Let me follow up with Doug a little bit. I'm curious about how AI can inform biotech research. You said you're cautious about the results, which I think is a great, very scientific way to approach things. So I really appreciate that. Is it improving your workflow, or what are some other benefits? And also, what are some of the new regulatory and ethical challenges that you're seeing raised by the use of AI that maybe we didn't have before?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the end of that. So we volunteer, if you have cancer and you get your tumor sequenced, you volunteer that up in the name of research, right? But then you don't really know, you're not presented with what that will be used for. And so you assume to cure cancer, but the genomic data it comes with normal tissue and it comes with cancer tissue, and the normal tissue can be used for a whole slew of other things. And so you basically run into this catch-22. For us to create the data, we have to collect the data. It's not like ChatGPT where the data is in the internet. You have to make it. And so you need to pay a lot of money to have tests run, and then you have to choose what those tests are and who gets tested. And so there's this whole hierarchy of biases that emerges when you have to create your own data on the fly with limited. It's essentially a version of lots of millions to billions of dollars, but it's still limited resources in terms of creating that type of data set that we think we need. And I think the big risks are what happens to the data if that company fails, what happens to the data if collaboration emerges between two countries. None of that is outlined very clearly to any of these patients. I think it's basically, we're going to use it for cancer and maybe some other things. And then that's different from depending on who's doing it. So a biotech can do it, a large pharma company can do it. They're all going to have different policies and different outcomes. They might have different survival timelines, in which case biotech, that data could be used for totally different things in less than 2 years. Biotechs have less lifetime. And so I think the biggest challenge, the biggest risks are trying to foresee how these biases will translate into biases of the products. So like the cure for cancer, but only for like white males. So like clinical trials are heavily tilted towards white males, by the way. I don't know if everybody knows that. But so the drugs will always be tilted towards white males if we use the data from the clinical trials. That's just a fact of AI. And we're trying to do different things there where we essentially try to tilt the data set by recruiting different people. But it doesn't get tilted all that much right now. So the mission is ongoing. So I'd say like the big risks are that these products work for subsets of people and we advance for those people, and then that the data could be misused. I mean, it can go all the way to bioterrorism threats. You could create a weapon, or well, it would be tilted towards white males too. But you see how complicated it is to see what the power of genomic data is. It's anything that you could think of. But if you say not used for this list of things, something will be off the list anyway that could come up later. So it's a very challenging situation, and then everybody's trying to move very fast, and that's another thing. And so that usually comes with a little bit of slog. And so I would say like those are the risks: is misuse and bias. And it's also like the diagnoses and everything too. So it's not just about the drugs. It could be about what is the nature of the disease. What are the things we want to change? The knob we want to turn on biology. That'll also be the knobs that are turned in white males and things like that. Those biases just like permeate the entire ecosystem right now.
And what are some of the benefits that you're seeing in terms of like tangible?
Yeah.
Just like
So
balance here.
tangible benefits is we're moving faster. And honestly, that's the clearest thing. I mean, the biggest tangible benefit that I think never gets talked about is that even I can program right now. So like the biologists can do Python programming because of ChatGPT. So everything that used to be a handoff between, which is always a messy handoff, but I mean, anytime I've ever done that, you have an experimentalist and you have a programmer, and the programmer wants the data to be cleaner, and the experimentalist is like, that's impossible. And then there's just all this time wasted on trying to communicate essentially how to solve the problem from the experimental standpoint, but also satisfy like programmers think they want to solve the problem. So if you just clap that up to one person, it's a very smooth handoff. It's very clear in one person's mind. And so that's the single largest instantaneous thing that happened in like 2023 was everybody became an amateur programmer. It's kind of like everybody's like like maybe the year before everybody was like a DJ, but so it's like so astonishing that everybody is like that.
Yeah, this is a great, and to the audience, if you haven't played around with the programming abilities of AI in your own life, I would suggest that you try it out. It's really easy to build personal mini apps that do a couple of things, and it'll do it for you. Kathleen, let me, in the same question, your clients that do research, what regulatory benefits or risks and new challenges are you seeing there?
I think Doug raised some really important questions about informed consent and issues related to that, about how this is being used, how the data is going to continue to be used. Calli also talked about data being used to train the models. I think that's something that people aren't really appreciating the scope of how their information can be used. And so trying to be really transparent with that, with the patients, study subjects is important. On the flip side, particularly when we do see instances where there are, patient informed consent or patient notice, patients don't seem to care that much. Partly because they're excited about the benefits. So it's a risk that I think we should be concerned about, but maybe one that we're blowing out of proportion because patients don't seem to care. So, it's good to do the thought experiment about how bad it could be though, because we're the ones thinking about it. So I think those are really interesting questions.
Calli, what about you in the research setting with AI?
The research setting is one of the more interesting ones to me, partly because inherently it has so many human checks built in, like there is so much quality check in many steps of the process. And that as opposed to a lot of other uses of AI you see where there's a lot of cases where AI is, for all sakes and purposes, the decision maker in a lot of cases. Like we're looking at AI use in housing, in loan applications, in education, in job applications. In a lot of those cases, we're seeing that like the AI is a tool, but when the AI spits out hire this person or don't hire this person, almost 100% of the time, people are just taking what the machine says and not double checking. the research setting is interesting to me because that isn't really the same risk that we're seeing in other areas.
Yeah. That's when the tool works well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that, it can be leveraged, that
Yes.
you find misuse of leveraging.
I absolutely believe
Yeah.
that, but it's an interesting thing because I can absolutely see the value in AI, like speeding up some of the processes in clinical trials. One of the real challenges with that is that it takes so long to do the levels of tests and checks that you need for each step of the process that by the time a drug comes out, it's decades in the making.
Yeah.
So I love the potential to speed up research that can help people. I think that's great, as long as there's good checks in the meantime. The other thing that's interesting to me with clinical trials is that, again, typically you're a lot more cautious about how the model is built and what information it's built on. The risk that I see in the clinical trial setting and in some of the other medical settings is that in many cases, depending on the way an AI system is built, if you discover that like it does have a serious bias problem in the way it's evaluating things, or an accuracy problem with the way that it's spitting out results, in many cases, that's not really something that's a quick fix for the program. There may be some where you're able to go in and like adjust weight values for how it's weighing information or data sets, but there are a lot of cases where it is so built on its own historic training that you essentially have to scrap the entire algorithm and rebuild it from scratch with more curated training data, paying more attention to those weights. So a problem I run into there, as well as many other places, is that if you identify a problem, the companies that develop those things are going to be very, very reluctant to address that problem in a meaningful way because it's a huge cost to them. So I'm interested to see what kind of oversight develops in the area.
Yeah, I think something that stands out to me when you look at it across all the different markets where AI is being used, the sort of perceived value of a problem impacts how likely it will be misused. So I'll give you an example. My company will fail if our drug doesn't work. So we will make sure that we curate anything that we use with AI and that the application for IND when we go to put drugs in humans has been written correctly. So everything is so high value, so high stakes that we would never just take it. It just wouldn't work. Everybody would see their job is on the line. And then as you go all the way to the other side of the market, like a good example is like hiring, right? Like if it produces okay candidates, but there's a lot of bias that's actually destructive for the candidates, but not for the company will do it. It's just nobody's job's on the line there. You will functionally serve, you will fill the role and you will have done your job. And so, but it won't be fair for society is the idea. So it would be tolerated and misuse now. And so I think it's all the way on that side where you're going to see like most of the discussion converge over the next 5 years because there's no curation.
Yeah, these are all great points. And just to put some language to this, one of the ideas you're talking about is something called as automation bias or algorithmic deference, where people tend to suspend their own professional judgment when a machine gives you a particular result because it seems authoritative. Even if you tell them, don't do that, exercise independent judgment. After a while, you just start relying on it, and that can be, problematic in some instances. Another point I'll point out, which is I definitely think the problem of algorithmic bias is important. And again, I always like to reference the baseline of the humans. Humans were also making biased decisions in their hiring. So it can be worse, and you can see in the AI context, the biases can be propagated, as you said. On the other hand, it's not inherently worse than the human baseline when humans were making, but we need to pay attention to it for sure. Let me follow up with Calli on some of the issues of privacy. So what I'm hearing, and if you see the landscape, a lot of it depends on good AI literacy, because the different AI systems offer a really wide variety of protections and abilities that range from strong protections to no protection. So for example, there are some AI systems which are known as SOC 2 compliant, but basically that means that they guarantee your security and privacy at among the highest levels and are subject to independent audits. So these are things like, today a lot of lawyers use Westlaw and they're very used to uploading confidential items up there, knowing that Westlaw has a lot of security guarantees in the background. Similarly, various AI systems, certain levels of ChatGPT or Anthropic offer similar areas. On the other hand, there's lots of free AI systems where if someone might enter in their personal information, their social security number, and you might go into a public data set that is out there on GitHub or Hugging Face or on DeepSeek, which is the Chinese model out there. So you really have to know what you're doing with your personal information. On the other hand, I will throw out again, this is helping a lot of people who don't have access to doctors get these, better information that they were getting about their health conditions, the conditions of their loved one, even their pets. I'm hearing. So, Calli, what are you thinking about a lot of this? Humans inputting their private data into various AI systems out there in the world.
Yeah, I on a personal level, I'm basically full tinfoil hat. So I admit I come into all of this with like a lot of bias, and the fact that my work is looking at like all of the ways things can go catastrophically wrong definitely means that I'm always a little more on the paranoid side of things than normal people. So I preface everything to say, like, take this with a grain of salt. I'm aware I have a bias. I'm trying to be as like factual and neutral as possible. When it comes to using AI in healthcare, I see with it a lot of the similar problems that I see in every other area when I'm looking at privacy issues. So I always care about, do people know what's happening with their information? Do they have rights over their information? Do they know how they can exercise those rights? Because if people choose to use these systems and put their information in, knowing what the risks are, knowing how it could be used, that's free choice. I'm never going to take that from people. The problem I have a lot of times is that people are not informed about what the risks are. In some cases, they won't even be informed that AI is being used. They don't necessarily know, like, if my information was scraped and put into a massive AI system, do I have the right to write them up and say, hey, I want you to delete that from your training data. I don't want that in there. It's also a bit of an issue when we're looking at transparency. Professor Surden's absolutely right that humans are also very much not infallible. Like, we know people make mistakes a lot. People have their own biases and history. And sometimes you just make a bad judgment call. The big distinction I see between people and machines in this case is that with people, if I think someone made a bad call, I can go back and say, explain your reasoning. Why did you decide this? Why did you go with this candidate over this candidate? Why did you decide this treatment is better than this treatment? Explain to me how you got there. And maybe we'll realize that they had a good thought process, but one part of it went awry and we can fix that. Maybe we find out that they didn't really think it through very well. There's different ways you can address it. With a lot of these machines, not all of them, some of them are good at tracking the steps they go through and kind of showing their work a little better. But with a lot of AI systems, it's virtually a black box once you get to the algorithm. And sometimes even the programmers can't really explain how a system generated the response that it did. That's a real problem when it comes to accountability. That's a real problem when it comes to liability. If something goes really wrong and someone gets the wrong treatment or dies, who's responsible for that? Someone needs to be responsible for that. And you really can't put a machine on the stand. So there needs to be a lot more transparency and openness in those situations for me. Another issue is when you're looking at HIPAA uses of AI, there are a few principles within HIPAA that are legally required that are really hard to do with AI systems. Like, for one example, HIPAA has a data minimization principle where if you're collecting information on a patient, you need to collect as little as possible to achieve your goal. Like, don't take in tons and tons of information. And that's for a lot of reasons. That's because some of it may be extraneous. That's because they don't necessarily know how you're going to use all that additional information. There may be misuse and risks associated with that. The nature of AI programming and AI systems and development is that they tend to operate on a more information makes more accurate algorithms and more accurate results. So it's skewed towards collecting as much data as possible. That's directly counter to the data minimization principle. and who exactly can make the determination of like what the minimum amount of data is for accurately training an AI and healthcare system. We don't really have answers for that yet. So I don't want to shut down AI in healthcare because there clearly are some really useful applications of it. But I do think we need a lot more education and outside oversight of how it's coming together. And it could be that there's some internal metrics for that we're just not aware of. But the lack of transparency as a whole is part of the biggest problem we have with AI, is that you really can't interrogate a lot of these questions in a meaningful way.
Yeah, those are great points. I especially like the patient autonomy point, whereas if you're making an informed choice, that's fine, but it's particularly challenging in this environment to make informed choices for all the reasons that you mentioned, not the least of which is both the technology changes over time. So what you might have thought happened in 2023 is very different in 2025. So just to give you a good example, on the early practices of the frontier labs like OpenAI or Anthropic were to not really think about collecting user data. Now they're much more thoughtful about it, and they actually have technology to try and get rid of personally identifiable information for training. That's for the frontier labs, very different from the other labs. On the other hand, they have new features. For example, ChatGPT has a memory feature now that in the background remembers stuff. So you might casually tell it, oh, I did this very sensitive thing, or I have this very sensitive condition. It remembers it and then will say things about it, maybe to another user using your prompt. But those are great points. Let me throw the same question out to the panel in terms of users entering private information voluntarily, but not really understanding consequences.
One that I've seen, so for a healthcare provider that engages a third party AI, so again, that scribe idea, if you're bringing a third party, one thing I've seen is that some of the tech companies will say, okay, you commit to providing at least this many charts per month, which to me says absolutely they're using that data to train the model, but they're not being transparent with the clinicians about. So even if the clinicians go to their patient and say, we're using this ambient AI, it's going to basically record what we're saying, that's going to help me with my notes. That's not disclosing to the patient that their data is also being used by this third party. So without that transparency and that flow of information, you can't really tell a patient what they're actually consenting to. So it's really not that informed consent, even if you try. So we have a significant lack of transparency. This is a little bit of an aside, but that lack of transparency also hinders regulation in other spaces like the medical device regulation. It's really hard to know if it should be regulated as a medical device if we don't know exactly what it is and what it's doing. So there's a lot of problems with the transparency, I think.
Yeah, great point. Sorry, did you stop?
Yeah, I mean, from like the builder side, we want to do things with AI that humans can't do. And so that's the big payoff, I think, here. It's not like there are payoffs that are not as big, like speed, things like that. But this is one where we cannot break the barrier at all. We can't find a cure for cancer. That's been a pretty well-established thing. So we can't understand non-linear problems. Humans just don't do that. So when a programmer does not know how the AI is working, it's because a programmer is a human and you cannot memorize that many things. And so if we're going to break through these barriers, we're going to have to collect immense amount of data. And so there is only one way. So like ChatGPT has been trained on everything, right? So the only thing that's left is to create data. So this is the free route to create it. So I'm actually a proponent of doing what they're doing, because it tends to tilt, these conversations tend to tilt toward why do we give up the data? And I think keeping the eye on the prize, that we're trying to do something that essentially leapfrogs humanity forward, is the reason. Having said that, if we can figure out what the misuse cases are, I think it helps a lot. So that people can do informed decisions by having the misuse cases at least presented in a document they essentially will never read, I'm sure. But that's basically what I think is only on the table at this point, is to just make a list of the things that could go wrong, present it with the people, and then that should solve the informed decision problem. But so like it's a very different depending on which area you are on. If you're in the evaluation sector or trying to protect people sector, you're focused on people, and so all your motivations are different. If you're trying to build, you're focused on like getting the product, and it's like so big the thing you're trying to build that you're like, if we have to crack eggs, we crack eggs. Like, so just giving you a perspective of like how different it is for different people, whether they care if the misuse is presented or not. And it's just it's just a truth. Most people that builders, they just think that will just make collecting the data slower, and we won't get there. And all the money will dry up, and everybody will doubt AI, and that it's more fragile than people think. It'll be perceived as like a .com bust if we don't actually make products that work in the short term. Yeah, or blockchain or every other giant perceived food done. Yeah.
No, those are great points. I really love both of those points, particularly the one about the black box. And one thing I'll throw out there, there's an area of research called mechanistic interpretability, which, as you said, Doug, humans can't understand the inner workings and Calli of modern neural network AI systems, but possibly other AI systems can. So mechanistic interpretability is using one AI system to interpret the output of another AI system. And I'm very optimistic that within 10 years, actually, we will have a much better window deterministically of why AI systems are producing one output from another based upon current level of research. But right now, we're not there. You're very much right that it's a black box. We don't know why it's producing its outputs. Great point.
Actually, we are there for images.
Yes.
So like we have software that, you can have generative AI, you can create all these models that create whatever you type, text to picture. But you have tools that can go in and basically show you like, what about a cat's face makes it be a cat? And so it'll show you like, it'll highlight the parts of the picture that are the heaviest weights. And that's really what the question is where do the weights lie to inform you where the biases lie? That's the same thing, essentially the same thing.
And a lot of that explainability like varies hugely by type of system. So there's a lot of models that are meant to be general purpose, general use models. Those have entirely different risk factors than models that are built for like specific bespoke purposes that are trained on limited data sets that are only available to certain groups that aren't like data sharing into a mass pool. Big differences across the board, and a lot of it depends on how much you understand of the system that you're interacting with and how much they're explaining to you about how their system's built.
Yeah, those are all great points, right? I think understanding the landscape of the technology, they all have different concerns. Let me pause here before we get to the next question and let students who a lot of them have class one. So this question is for Kathleen initially. So we're seeing that AI is being used in diagnosis and treatment, and there's some really interesting questions. On the one hand, we want to make sure that it's accurate and reliable, and there might be problems of malpractice if, say a doctor uses AI and it gives the wrong diagnosis and they rely on it, and it's interesting to see. On the other hand, there's some interesting research that AI is outperforming doctors in a lot of settings. So one fascinating article that came out in JAMA Open a couple of months ago, they did this study where they had three groups. They had doctors using just a non-specialized large language model, which is GPT-4, doctors using traditional diagnostic methods without technology. And then they just inputted case settings to GPT-4 from OpenAI alone, just asked it and took its first diagnosis. And they just wanted that as a control. And the expectation was basically that the doctors using the AI model would outperform the doctors using the traditional methods. And they used the third group as a control. What actually happened was using AI alone without any doctors vastly outperformed the doctors with the traditional methods and the doctors using AI by about 16 percentage points. in terms of accuracy. To me, that was kind of fascinating. And the doctors who use the large language models slightly outperform, not statistically different, the doctors who use the traditional method. Of course, this needs to be taken with a grain of salt. It's a small study. They used highly structured diagnostic facts that were very hard, so it doesn't actually replicate the real world. So take it with a grain. And there are other studies that show the opposite. But I find that fascinating there. And so my question is, how do we get our tort system and our practice system to understand the nuances of this? On the one hand, we want doctors to use it when it's good, but also we don't want the court system necessarily saying, oh, this AI system made an error, shut it down if on average it's leading to better patient outcomes. So how do you think about this?
Yeah, I think there's a really fundamental, I don't want to say clash, but there's a tension between healthcare and medical professionals who have the ethos of do no harm and taking care of patients, that sacred patient-provider relationship. And on the tech side, you have to move fast and break things. And there's really value in both. We do want to protect patients, but we are seeing tremendous benefit to adopting these models quickly. And so, hopefully we come out somewhere in the middle that works, because in healthcare, it's so important. It's personal, it's people's health, it's lives. So moving fast and breaking things is different when you're talking about health. It's different when we're talking about people and their health and their lives. So I think ultimately we're going to end up in a shared responsibility, but it's going to be interesting. We think about malpractice now, it's always a reasonable physician, but a reasonable physician have done this. And I think we're going to get to the point where a reasonable physician would have used an AI tool. And so if they didn't, that's going to be a challenge. But then, some more nuance there of what tools. There are good tools and bad tools, and we're moving fast. And so there are some good tools out there and there are some bad tools. And how is a physician supposed to know the difference? They're not developers, they're not this area. And I think within a big system, maybe you're a little better off because you have more ability to build your own tools or to assess the quality of the tools that you're using. So I think there's going to be some significant growing pains. Ultimately, I think we will land in a shared responsibility where the clinicians are kind of the last, they're the last stand between the patient and these systems, which is a different role. And I think of thinking about clinicians as more about the communication, which is an interesting change that I'm not sure clinicians are really up for. We'll see.
And I teach torts. Our tort system is not the fastest to incorporate changes in technology. Yeah, so how do you?
But what is a little bit faster is insurance.
That's a great point.
I think we're already starting to see some insurance products. Pricing them is still really challenging. But some insurance products, both for clinicians who are using AI and also for AI developers who are putting a product on the market to say, I have insurance for things that might go wrong. What's carved out of the policy and what's priced in is a little bit of Wild West right now, but I think that's going to be probably the quickest move on the liability front.
Yeah, and throw this out to the rest of the panel. What do you think about the idea of, legal changes to adapt to these, medical changes uses of AI?
I'll pass that.
Yeah.
So before I worked at Epic, I worked for a firm in Denver, and then I did client compliance work for companies. And some of those companies included companies that were developing healthcare applications, and they were very, very careful about how they built them because there's a lot of requirements when you're in that field. But we were doing a lot of the checks on are you meeting the standards you need to meet? What existing laws apply to the technology that you're using? And I never have come across a technology where there is no existing law that touches on the issues we're seeing. There are some unique issues in AI, certainly, because it does things at a speed and scale that we do not see in a lot of other technology. But even if there are gaps in coverage, and I definitely think there are gaps in legal coverage there still are a lot of laws that do apply and that these companies have to meet. So product fitness, the way that you're advertising your product, is it actually as accurate as you claim it is? Are you running tests on that? Do you have outside checkers on that? Are you disclosing everything that your product does? Are you disclosing the risks? Have you done internal testing on that? How many rounds? Do you have contracts in place with everyone you're selling things to that very clearly delineate who is responsible if you're inputting data you shouldn't be inputting into that system or using it in a way it wasn't designed for? I used to write those policies and they are so stressful. But I think for a lot of this, applying the laws that we have now is a very important and good step, and one that is not happening as often as it should. Not necessarily in the healthcare space, but in other spaces, we're definitely running into problems where AI developers are claiming that their product is an exception to an existing law, and I don't see anything to back that up other than they really want the existing law to not apply. I think applying things that exist now is a way that we identify where the gaps are, and we can see how much regulation needs to adapt to the changing realities of a world where there is widespread AI use, or an industry where there's widespread AI use in specific ways. So I think in general, the hospital legal teams are going to be very busy figuring out where those gaps are.
Yes, you're all in a growth business here, which is
Yeah.
good. There's a great point, Calli, which I love, which is, this is something I'm advocating for as well. Before you pass a new law about AI, let's make sure we don't have existing laws on the book that can adequately do what it is you need to be done. And that's an absolutely terrific point there. Okay, we're at the point where I'd love to open this up to the audience for questions. We have a tradition to opening up to students first. So do we have any students in the room here? Yes, thank you.
So first of all, great hearing about all your experiences and everything. So I come from a technical background. I'm doing my graduate studies over here. And I just have, so I read this article in the news. So it basically says how your eye scans or your retinal scans can be used to predict the gender of, let's say gender in general. So how do you think scaling this to, I don't know, healthcare setting can perpetuate bias, or like what do you guys think about that?
Training data. So the models are biased because the training data is biased. So whose retinas will dictate where it's accurate. So I think all the problems to me are very similar. It doesn't matter what the application is. It's like bias, consent. So and probably there is a possibility, by the way, that certain signatures cannot code for certain outcomes. That there is no path to accuracy that's good enough for us to say that this is not a dangerous tool. So just like that, let's say your retina scan is supposed to diagnose your cancer. It is possible that there is no way to do that. That if you fast forward to the end of the whole story, it cannot do that. But it can get close enough to be really destructive to people. And so you have to keep that in mind too. That it's not always the case that like the tea leaves can read everything. Yeah. So.
Yeah, this is a great point. And of course, it's the time to mention, there's a lot of nonsense and bad research on AI where people have made all sorts of predictions about it's kind of modern phrenology. If you know what that is, it's kind of, we can predict such and such characteristics, based upon, these, and it turns out not to pan out, or it has so many false positives and false negatives. So that is a really great point. Anyone else want to weigh in on the question?
I definitely thought of the digital phrenology
Yeah,
thing. There are a lot of studies that are trying to make connections and trying to make different claims, and sometimes they do pan out. Like sometimes you find out there is actually a biological marker for being able to detect XYZ thing in ways you didn't expect. Those require so much testing to be really sure you're right on those cases, because if you're wrong, it can cause just catastrophic problems, especially if you're using it for diagnosis and stuff like that. One of the issues we run into a lot is every few months or so, there's another study or paper or something that pops up that says that through facial recognition analysis, we're able to tell your likelihood of criminality or your levels of aggression or things like that. None of that has ever been accurate. There are a lot of really good studies of why that can't be accurate, and people just refuse to accept that can't be accurate. So.
Accurate enough to not be destructive.
Yes, yes, and really, like, if you're predicting someone's likelihood of criminality, that's not gonna go anywhere good.
Right, you're already asking.
Like the result,
Loaded
yeah,
question.
the results of that are not going to a place that we want society to go to.
Yeah.
Guilty by facial structure is a pretty concerning precedent to set.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, for a lot of these studies and this research, people often have goals that are good at their core. Like being able to use irises to identify gender could be really helpful when you're trying to deal with like identification programming or even basics of like, do you want a retinal scan to get into a very secure facility? This could be an additional factor to that. So it's not that all of this comes from bad places, and sometimes we may find some really interesting, cool uses of it, but all of it just has to be vetted really carefully. And you know, pull in weirdos that always think of worst case scenarios, because we'll come up with some real good worst case scenarios for you to consider.
Yeah, and and these tools have to be used properly, even if not. So a good
Yeah.
example is facial recognition in policing has all sorts of problems, not the least of which it's used just incorrectly. So there's one famous case where somebody took an artist's sketch of a suspect and then fed that to the facial recognition. It identified somebody and they arrested him. That has so many problems.
Yeah.
It just shows a complete lack of understanding why. But you know, you would not necessarily expect the police to have the level of technical detail to, you know, make that decision. So it shows when these tools are out there, they're sometimes used in problematic ways. Other questions? Yes.
I'm Dan Murray, Rocky Mountain AI Interest Group. So I want to take the patient side of the note taker and tell you the use case that I want. So I have a friend whose parents are on the East Coast. Her dad is sick, and the parents go into a medical appointment, and the kids get like a 3-word summary, right? Right? They find out nothing that's going on. So what about a system where the parents say, okay, we release to our family this appointment, and then the kids can you know, look at the summary of the appointment, maybe through an LLM, and essentially have a conversation with the appointment. You know, like explain those medical terms to me, like at the level of an 8th grader. I don't understand all those fancy medical terms. What's typically done in this case? Like, what are some of the treatments that might be recommended that the doctor didn't suggest? So one is, does that exist? And number 2, do you see ethical issues around that?
Let me parse that a little bit. So I think there are versions of that, maybe not directly, but versions within an EMR portal. So patient, you log into your portal. There are versions we're seeing with patient education and some chatbots and things like that. But the extent to which it spits it out to family members, I think that's a harder one, largely for the privacy considerations.
I'm
And
just saying, everyone signs off. Like,
Yeah,
yes, the
everyone
kids
signs
can
off.
have it, totally, you know, agree, you know.
yeah, and I think that is how you would do it.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing a lot of that yet. I think partly because there are so many privacy and, you know, especially when you're talking about aging folks or folks with dementia, you're also talking about competency and, like, you know, were they competent to authorize this and who's the decision maker? And there are other things that you're gonna wanna think about with who all is viewing this information and how are they viewing it. I think that to me is the last frontier in medicine and healthcare. I think we are going to have people doing the communication for a long time. And I think we can do a much better job as a healthcare system of having people have those conversations with family members and caregivers. And, you know, I think access to a library of resources and things like that is something that we'll see develop quicker. But I think having a person to have those communications can help manage some of not only the privacy sensitivities, but also, you know, the family tension and the decision making and all of those things that can come in when you're talking about situations like that. But certainly tools that can help the person communicating with that as well.
It often seems like there's no one that has that role, you know, like they went to their doctor, there's no one that can explain it, they don't have time, we're in the dark, and so, yeah, I was wondering about AI to kind of bridge
The
that
tool
gap.
is there.
Yeah.
So we have ChatGPT, Perplexity, the list goes on. DeepSeek. So you can ask the questions and you can get answers, but we were here before. WebMD.
Right.
So the big question is, should we be having conversations without the doctor and interpreting results without the doctor? And I think then we said no. That WebMD is clearly terrible. It's just like a list of things. There's not,
We all
who
have
puts
cancer all
that
the time.
list together is the biggest bias possible. ChatGPT is a bigger data set, so it does converge on some sort of accuracy for those particular problems, like summarize literature. These are things that LLMs are good at. Should you have the conversation with a doctor? My vote is no. My vote is that you will most likely err towards misinterpretation. And all you need to do is talk to the doctor to not have that happen.
Yeah.
They can be wrong too, but a lot less than you would be interfacing an LLM.
I think one thing that's also interesting to me is, to your point, there's often not a person in that role. And we have a lot of problems in our healthcare system that this panel's not about, but we're overlaying these tools on that system. And so we have clinicians who are totally overburdened, and we have insurance companies that are using AI to not pay. And we have all of these pressures. We have a fee-for-service system rather than a population health system. We have all of these different issues in our healthcare system that there's some real opportunity for AI to help with. And so I'm optimistic that we'll see some changes in that area. But there are also risks of, bringing these tools on top of an already broken system without that thoughtfulness.
Calli, do you have thoughts about this or?
No, I think it's a good question, and I think that's a really good example of like seeing how a tool functions and where you can plug it into a system. Because at this point, it sounds like the tool would be good at summarizing notes from an appointment. We have tools that do that pretty accurately and pretty consistently. It sounds like this is maybe a systemic problem where it is trying to figure out like a restructure of how client-patient communication, family doctor communication, like restructuring and rethinking how you can do that, whether maybe AI opens up the capacity for being able to do that more. And that's great if it enables a lot more communication that way. As you said, it would be a situation where you need to make sure you've got all the basic checks in place, like you make sure that they're competent to agree for their family to have the information, you make sure that agreement's in place. You make sure that it's going through like secure channels, so you're not just blasting it everywhere. But yeah, I think there's some really interesting possibilities there. It's just a matter of making sure you don't rush into it without ensuring you've got like an infrastructure around that maintains safety and patient dignity.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if we saw something like that in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's present now.
Yeah.
It's available if you go on the portal at UH or Children's Hospital. But the problem with parents and children is the same thing. It's there. People are already using it. It's already available. It's got all the pros and cons you discussed.
Yeah, and Dr. Viktorov is a clinical professor at Anschutz who works in this area of AI and law. Yes.
And I know I have a doctor next to me. So I got a couple of things. One, I had a family member in the ER a couple of weeks ago. They thought he was having a heart attack and they just could not figure out what was going on with him. I used Perplexity and ended up finding out that it was a rare symptom of a rare disease that he has and sort of helped the doctor walk through how to diagnose it. I just want to throw that out as a data point because you mentioned that study where you were saying that doctors with, so one of my companies is a medical legal company. And one of the founders is very, very smart orthopedic surgeon. And he wants us to throw an LLM into the product. And what I'm finding is that he does not have the education to know how to use it. So I'm wondering, in that study that you mentioned, does it talk about how educated the doctors were that were using the LLM?
Yeah, so they basically didn't really educate them that much because they were trying to, I think they gave them some like basic guidelines, but you're right. So one could, and also remember the technology changes. So as AI gets better, the doctors that use better AI might start outperforming. But this is a great, I think AI literacy, this is one of the things I work on in law. It's one of the biggest issues because the technology is changing, how it, like for instance, a lot of people have heard of prompt engineering. It's not that important anymore. Most people don't know that. That was important in 2023 and 2024, but the systems have gotten better such that minor prompt differences, but most people are still using the narratives that they saw in the news a year ago, and businesses will come, allow you to pay them thousands of dollars to teach prompt engineering when it's not that important. So keeping up with the technology, I don't know, what do you guys think about, this is an interesting scenario
Well,
here.
is that totally true that it's still not? So if you use certain language that errs towards certain literature, it should bias the outcome. Because it should be seen as two separate problems. What does like journal articles say, and what does the internet, essentially the rest of the internet, like whatever was scraped for training ChatGPT, it should give you a different answer. Even if prompt engineering is sort of being worked on.
Yeah, so it's more that the issue, so the big problem of prompt engineering was, the uses of certain words, seemingly equivalent prompts.
Yeah.
Certain words would give you radically different answers. So different prompts will still give you different answers, but the same seemingly equivalent prompt will now give you roughly the same answer. That was the big issue where people were using, like accidentally sticking a word like sincere, and it would start, writing something emotional and not realizing that. But you're right,
Yeah.
so it's not
Yeah.
a totally different issue.
Well, it's like lingo is so important for the perspective or the source of the information.
Right.
So, I mean, that's what I was thinking when you said training. I was thinking like, did you use the professional terms, or did you use the slang terms?
When I was doing the diagnosis for my friend in the hospital, I was in the medical field for a long time, so I was writing it up as if I was a doctor, basically.
Part of that too is definitely like the sophistication of how you input a prompt definitely makes a difference, but another part of it is if any industry is going to be making regular use of a new technology, you have to do like really deliberate training on it. A bunch of recent studies of AI show that people use it most often as a search engine. That's not really what it's for in most cases. So if you're getting all of your information and assuming it's facts from ChatGPT, you're gonna have some wrong information in there. There's a lot of attorneys that are using ChatGPT to find cases that are, turns out, made up cases that they're putting into briefs without double checking. That's a problem. And so it's an issue where I think definitely the training is a huge factor, and I would argue that you shouldn't be using AI unless you've been through some training on it and understand what it can and can't be used for. In the medical field, at least, it's a very high risk that if it goes wrong, it can go really wrong. And so I'm not saying you need to like take a course and learn how to build an AI system. That's too much. I use my phone every day. I don't know how to build an iPhone. It's okay. But you should be able to take, like your hospital should offer a class or two on like, this is how this system works. This is what it's really good for. This is how you can use it in your practice and it can help your practice. Just so there's at least a kind of level setting of what expectations are, and we're not over relying on technology that we may not necessarily be using accurately. But as you said, like there's some really, really great helpful uses of it. And so it also helps make better use of those.
I anticipate seeing some more medical board regulation around this. The Federation of State Medical Boards has put out some guidance about clinicians have the obligation to know how to use these tools and to double check and verify and all of that. So medical boards themselves have been a little slow to adopt new guidance, but I expect that to happen soon.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. We could talk about this all day, but unfortunately, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our terrific panel.